Welcome to another Talking Feds one-on-one. House Republicans have been content to be pliable, even indolent, and have their power usurped by Donald Trump for the most part, but with a few exceptions. And maybe one of the most important is legislation that they passed last year and maybe introduced any day that goes to voting rights, the so-called SAVE Act, that is basically a bucket list of provisions to especially depress likely Democratic voters, but especially involving identification. With the parties already on a knife's edge, it could have a huge ongoing impact. So I think it's really important to understand what it does, how it works. And I've asked and been delighted that he accepted, to my mind, the national expert on the law and really on voting rights generally. That's Michael Waldman. He's the president and CEO of the Brennan Center for Justice. It's a nonpartisan law and policy institute dedicated to strengthening democracy and justice. He's had many roles in government. He was previously director of speech writing for President Bill Clinton, where we first met. He's the author of too many books to count, including The Supermajority, How the Supreme Court Divided America, and The Fight to Vote, among many others. Michael Waldman, thanks so much for joining us.
It's great to be with you. Thank you for having me.
All right, so let's jump right into the SAVE Act. That's one of these neat acronyms, Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act. H.R. 8281 was introduced last year and passed July in the House, introduced by Chip Roy. So tell us about it. I know it's just speculation, but there's at least some word on the ground. If you read the vibrations, it could be introduced anytime. That's just in the House. But let's talk about it substantively. What's its kind of main and most worrisome provision?
Yes, you're absolutely right that this is one of the Congressional Republican Party's top priorities. And in fact, in the House of Representatives, at the very beginning of the term, they crafted rules for about a dozen bills that mean they could go through fast on an expedited basis, and this is one of the top ones. This legislation would effectively require everybody to produce a passport or a birth certificate, with few exceptions, to register and thus to vote, or even to re-register to vote in the United States. This would be a big change in how we do voter registration. It would exclude many millions of people.
Let me stop you there, because I'm trying to wait. Where's my birth certificate? Wait,
exactly.
Where's my passport? But for others, give us you've thought about this a lot. Who does this really affect most directly?
Well, for starters, according to our research at the Brennan Center, at least 21 million people don't have ready access to a birth certificate or a passport. For starters, about half of all Americans don't have a passport. You know, they're not summering in the south of France. They don't have a passport. And as for birth certificates, the key is people may or may not have a birth certificate, but they have no idea where it is. So it's in a shoe, isn't it in a shoebox in my mother's closet? And the kind of thing that you would need it to find a way to obtain it to go to vote. So that's at least 21 million people. It would affect a lot more people than that, especially poor voters, voters of color, but especially married women. Because if you think about it, many, many married women, tens of millions of married women in the United States change their names when they get married. So the voter registration information, which is current, maybe matches their driver's license, is different from their birth certificate. We actually don't know how many this would affect, but there's every reason to think that tens of millions and tens of millions of people would suddenly be disenfranchised if they tried to register or re-register. In some states, when you move from one house to another, you have to register again. It's really crazy, and it really would affect a lot of people.
Let me say, I want to go back to what they're doing, but in substance, how would you be completely kosher here I am, and I'm like you. I don't know where the hell my birth certificate is, and maybe I could find a passport. But to impeccably comply with the letter of the law, and of course, a lot of this is going to be administered by state, local election officials, and might get caught up in the maw of politics. But to hear a proponent say, "Oh, no problem. Here's all you do." What do you do today? You woke up, you're gonna register. What must you do to know you're okay?
Well, you wouldn't be able to just show up with a driver's license or some other form of ID, which we've been told all along was what you needed. You'd have to show up with a
Motor
passport.
voter, right? Didn't that
Right.
happen in '93?
You'd
Yeah.
have to show up with a passport or a certified copy of your birth certificate. And, in some instances, but this,
Show up where?
well, that's the interesting thing. One of the things that this affects is it would undo the voter registration systems of every state. It would mean you could not register anymore online, which is very popular, increasingly popular. You couldn't register by mail. You could not register in a voter registration drive because you would need to produce your passport to show, the League of Women Voters or something like that. And it wouldn't count as producing it to the government. It would make automatic voter registration, which is often at DMVs and things like that, much harder unless people remembered to show up with all the paperwork. And so it actually undoes the whole system of voter registration in the United States in a way that election officials of both parties are quite concerned about. This is not what anyone asked for, including Republican as well as Democratic registrars, county officials, and others who have to handle and manage this kind of thing. So it really would affect many, many people. And it does so for no good reason. The proponents of the bill say, oh, this is to stop non-citizen voting. Non-citizen voting is already highly illegal. States already have a multiplicity of systems in place to make sure it doesn't happen. And in fact, it doesn't happen very often. And everybody agrees that this is not the problem is not remotely as big as the problems caused by the solution. And one of the people who kind of fessed up to this, why are they doing this, is one of the questions. This bill really got its momentum last year when Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, whose majority, of course, hangs by a thread, one of the times he looked like he was going to lose his seat, he went down to Mar-a-Lago. And as the price for Trump saying he should stay in as speaker, Johnson had to pledge to bring this bill and move it forward. But he held a press conference. He could barely kind of maintain he barely stayed in character. He said, well, it's true. There's no actual evidence of this happening, but intuitively we know it must be happening. That's how you know it's happening, is that there's no evidence of it. And intuitively it must be happening. And therefore we need to do this bill. But the consequences of it are significant. And again, it would affect women and voters without a passport, voters who don't have access to their birth certificate, poorer voters, all kinds of folks who often are impacted by these voter suppression laws. This is not an immigration bill. It's a voter suppression bill.
Okay. And why are Republicans so high on suppressing voters?
That is a deep question. We could go on for a long time, and
I mean,
at
it is
least one book on the
superficially.
subject.
Does it maybe seem like certain voters are going to be more suppressed than other voters? Let me put it that way.
There's the general backlash over many years, predating Donald Trump, to a lot of demographic change and other things where Republicans got it in their heads that there must be a lot of misconduct and that what we're going to do is try and restrict the vote, try to change the rules in some way. And very often in a targeted way that affects voters who are seen to be voting for Democrats. Donald Trump, of course, has taken that to a new level. For him, the notion that the 2020 election was stolen is a central political tenet and an organizing tenet. It is, among many other things, a job interview question that people all throughout the administration are being asked, do you think really Trump won? And was January 6th just a pleasant day on the mall? I've heard, and I don't know if this is true, but it's plausible, that scientists at Lawrence Livermore Lab were being asked this question. I can't vouch for that, but that's the kind of thing that seems to be happening. In fact, at the local level, away from the very partisan hothouse of Congress, there's much more cooperation and much more sensible work by people from all parties on elections. In the wake of what happened in 2020, in the wake of all the charges of a rigged election, there's been really a lot of work to strengthen the systems of how we cast our votes. They're really secure now. When Trump says we need to make sure that we vote on paper, he's actually right. The good news is almost everybody does vote on paper. You have these machines to count the ballots, which is definitely better, more accurate than people counting them, grandma and grandpa counting them by hand. But you can do a recount and check for fraud if you've got a paper record. So there's things like that, cybersecurity improvements, bringing in law enforcement so that police and prosecutors now are much more aware of their duty to protect the right to vote than has been the case. So at the local level and in the states, there's really been a great deal of improvement. But in the hothouse atmosphere of Congress and the green room of television networks, this kind of thing moves along. But this bill, the way I describe it is, this is not the worst voting bill ever dreamed up by anyone ever. However, if it were to actually pass, it would be the worst voting bill ever passed by Congress. Because throughout the country's history, the federal government, Congress, has improved voting rights, often having to step in when states are abusing the rights of their own people. This would be the first time that Congress, in a big way, stepped in and undid the voting rights of people in states. And that would be a really terrible thing.
Talking Feds is supported by the Brennan Center for Justice. In this new political era, the Brennan Center will do what they do best: defend the Constitution and the rule of law. They're prepared to fight against presidential overreach and will continue advocating for reforms to resist weaponized government, stop billionaires from corrupting our elections, and ensure every eligible American has the freedom to vote. Stay informed by visiting BrennanCenter.org.
I want to double back and ask a few more things, but let's push forward just on the point you've made, Michael. So first, do you have a sense, as you say, Johnson hangs by a thread? I think it's 2 votes or whatever. If it were introduced tomorrow, there is a lot of enthusiasm. Do you identify a sort of small group of Republicans who might not sign on? I guess that's point one. And then point two, do you see, I'm sure it being America, that it were to pass, there would be legal challenges, but do you see kind of serious pretty solid legal possible claims against it?
Yeah, so in terms of the political prognostication, as you said, it did pass the House last term, mostly on party line vote, though there were a bunch of Democrats who voted for it. I think many fewer Democrats will vote for it this time in the House because they've come to understand what it does. Nobody wants non-citizens to be able to vote. People these days are very, willing to vote for laws that they think are tough on illegal immigration, and that was at least part of why some Democrats voted for it last time. I think there will be many fewer Democrats in the House, if any, who will vote for it this time because they see it as a voting bill first and foremost, because the state election officials are perturbed about the way this ends online registration, voter registration by mail, voter registration drives, really hurts automatic registration, all the ways people actually register to vote in the United States today. I think that it's very possible that a lot of Republican members of Congress will at least have some hesitation. In the Senate, it's a kind of legislation that requires.
And by the way, just to say, last year it passed the House, but wasn't brought to a vote in the Senate, right?
Right. Now, of course, in the last Congress, the Democrats controlled the Senate. This time, the Republicans do, and it is the case that legislation like this can be filibustered, and so it would require 60 votes to overcome that, to get cloture, as it's called. And again, I think that there's a fairly strong chance that, again, not just Democrats, but that plenty of Republicans in the Senate would be pretty nervous about this, just because it really upends a lot of things and not for very much genuine gain in terms of protecting election integrity.
And yeah, and there could be messes on the other side. Okay. Some of it is imponderable, but I want to look, here's what bugs me about the bill so much is how dishonest it is. I think just from my experience in federal law enforcement, first, if you just think in common sense, why does a person who's not eligible to vote and is a legal immigrant want to put everything on the line to have his one vote for the school
into a government
superintendent?
office and hand the proof of your crime to a government official? Doesn't happen.
I mean, so it really doesn't happen. And it really, I think, is about vote suppression. But let me make another point that's just a real point. We've been positing the ideal voter, highly motivated to find all their things. Not everybody is. And the idea of the system ought to be to make it easier for people to vote. And I just think, logically, with no data to back it up, there's just going to be a lot of people who it's a pain in the ass, or you can maybe find your passport, but you don't know where, and you're busy.
Especially younger voters.
Not just... younger
voters who don't have a history of voting and a civic ritual.
Don't show up anyway. Right. I just think, practically speaking, right?
And that's true if you think about waiting on a long line to vote, which doesn't happen in most communities. It happens in places like Black communities. It happens in college campuses. If somebody's a new voter, they don't have a long history of voting, there's all kinds of evidence that they're just deterred. I'd rather go get a cup of coffee than have to wait in the cold to vote. And we've made tremendous progress, bipartisan progress on the system of how we do voting in this country. I mentioned automatic voter registration, which the Brennan Center had a lot to do with crafting that idea. It's now the law in 19 states, Republican states as well as Democratic states, and it's significantly increased registration levels. Think about what happened in 2020. We had, of course, it's now about 5 years ago to the day when the country shut down, for a week or two. And, but at that very beginning, it was in the middle of the presidential primaries, and it was chaos, and people had to close down their elections. I remember the Wisconsin primary was being held, and there was a fight between the governor and the speaker of the legislature in Wisconsin over whether the primary should go forward. And the speaker held a press conference saying, it's fine, everybody should go vote, there's no reason to be afraid. And he was wearing a hazmat suit at the time he said that. So it was a crazy situation. And it really looked as though come November, we didn't know what was going to happen, but that weren't necessarily going to have free and fair, effective elections. And so states really jumped into action, and we at the Brennan Center had a lot to do with it. But all the things that became quite familiar, significantly expanded in-person early voting, universal access to vote by mail. Not everybody voting by mail, but it becoming much easier. Back in 2020, safe in-person polling places, which in 2020 turned out to be big box stores and arenas because they were big. It was a real civic mobilization. Businesses mobilized, major corporations and other businesses mobilized about 600,000 people to be poll workers, to replace the often elderly poll workers who weren't able to do it. It was a mobilization not for a candidate or a party, but for the cause of the election, so that by election day, despite the once-in-a-century pandemic, it was the highest voter turnout since 1900. And
who can be against that, really? But
and the Department of Homeland Security under Trump said it was the most secure election in American history.
Right.
It was a high watermark, and it just shows us that we can actually do these elections and do them well, and have them be trusted and have them be effective. Now, we thought everybody who was involved in that should get a medal. That wasn't the only reaction. You had Donald Trump's claim of a stolen election and the insurrection that flowed from that, and a bunch of laws trying to cut back on people's voting rights. But the fact is, we've seen how it can work, that you can actually, in a kind of calm way, make the elections as secure as they've ever been. And so this is not needed legislation, but the consequences of it would be really harmful.
Yeah. By the way, there's a broader theme here. I'm just going to touch it and go forward. But, we've always had, you mentioned grandma and grandpa, we've had this sort of homely, in the literal sense, kind of system of good, virtuous people volunteering. But with all the pressure now being put on the election system by both parties, you really have needed to replace what had been the kind of nice civic-minded folks with, some of these guys are on the front lines. Okay, so you have no control, the Brennan Center, over when or whether it's introduced, but at that point, there'll be a lot of, I think, thinking and strategizing on your part about the individual legislators, as you said. Should it pass, about what happens in the Senate? Should it pass there and Trump sign it, about what happens in the courts? So to the extent this becomes not just a scary monster out there, but actually comes to pass, we'll really hope to be able to come back to you, Michael, and think about what is to be done. But thanks very much for your time today.
Thank you so much. And again, we've all been so mesmerized by all the executive orders. This is real legislation that can't just be undone by the next president with an executive order. This would be in the books of law.
Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this video and other Talking Feds content, please take a second to like and subscribe. Talk to you later.